What's up, guys? Ruben here with another video. My name's Ruben Lopez and I'm from New York, son. So really quick, I'm going to be doing a quick comparison of the A7S Mark II, a camera that came out about 5 years ago, versus the Panasonic S5, a camera that just came out recently this year, about 2 months ago. I'm going to be talking about the reasons why I chose to upgrade to the Panasonic S5 from the A7S Mark II, and I'm also going to be talking about some of the features and maybe as to why you really wouldn't want to upgrade if you do own the A7S Mark II, or if you're in my situation and you want to create or you do create the kind of content that I create, then maybe you might look forward to upgrading to the Panasonic S5 if you're coming from the A7S Mark II. Now, I do have these cameras set to auto, so all the settings are set to fully auto, including ISO, shutter speed, the whole entire nine. Everything is set to auto. And out of the A7S Mark II, I do have the Tamron 17 to 28 millimeter lens, but I did zoom in to 20 millimeters just to make it a little bit more of an even fight. And on the Panasonic S5, I have the kit lens, which is the 20 millimeters to 60 millimeters. Now, for some apparent reason, I do have the A7S Mark II set to 20 millimeters, but it still looks wider than the Panasonic S5, which looks like it's more of a 22 millimeters to 60 millimeters. So not a fair comparison whatsoever. The Tamron 17 to 28 millimeter lens should be a sharper lens, but the Panasonic S5 does not have a low pass filter built into the sensor, so maybe it might pull off the same amount of sharpness and detail. Now, out of the Panasonic S5, I am recording at 4K, Cinema 4K at 10-bit at 150 megabytes per second and H.265. And on the A7S Mark II, I'm recording at 8-bit at 100 megabytes per second at 4K also, but Ultra HD, not Cinema 4K. Now, that might sound like it's better to record in Cinema 4K because you record a little bit more of the image or you get a little bit more resolution, but when you're editing to YouTube, which uses an Ultra HD timeline, you're actually losing a little bit of that detail just because you're only getting that Ultra HD. Even though you're recording the 4K, you're only using the Ultra HD. So the 150 megabytes per second is going to the wider 4K cinema, and you're only using the Ultra HD. So if you're recording into the Ultra HD, it'll be, I'm going off on a bit of a rant here, let me just chill out. So to me, it doesn't really matter what shoots 10-bit, what shoots Cinema 4K, what shoots 6K, 8K. To me, what matters is that it looks good out of the camera, because 99% of the time I'm shooting in fully auto, and that's actually what you want to shoot 99% of the time, is in fully auto. You never want to go manual with the focusing, you never want to go manual with any of your settings. You want to let the camera do the job for you, because the way technology is moving, going fully auto is the way to go. If you're gonna go manual, you're gonna like miss focus, you're gonna screw up the ISO, you're gonna have to try to fix all of that in post. Back in the days, it was important for professionals to go fully manual because the cameras didn't do that much of a good job. But in 2020, or even from 2015 when the A7S Mark II was announced, fully auto was the way to go, and it actually produced a better image than doing things manually. People are going to argue that, especially professionals that are up there in age, like in their 40s, 50s, that have been shooting video for the past 20 years, and they're just accustomed to shooting things in manual. But if you speak to some of the younger guys that deal with the cameras, they know that going fully auto is the way to go. You don't have to take my word for it. You can also listen to Gerald Undone, where he basically talks about how you shouldn't buy an external recorder for your cameras, and you shouldn't shoot in manual because the camera does a better job most of the time. So I hope you guys do enjoy this long, tedious video. I'm going to just go off on a little bit of a rant about the two cameras, just in case you guys were stuck in the same dilemma as me, where the A7S Mark III was announced. There's a limited stock of it. Plus, it costs $3,500. Do you really want to upgrade to $3,500? Or will the Panasonic S5, which costs $2,000 US, will do for you like it has done for me? Now, I'm going to go ahead and make this comparison a little bit unfair. I'm going to go ahead and switch to the Panasonic S5, and I'm going to go and start recording in 6K mode real quick. 6K out of the Panasonic S5. It does have a little bit of a crop where it only uses 3/4 of the sensor, but it does record at 200 megabytes per second, 6K at H.265. So that's pretty insane specs right there for a $2,000 camera. And now out of the Sony A7S Mark II, I did zoom in to 24 millimeters just to have the cameras basically almost in the same frame. Also, I would like to point out that the Panasonic S5, while it's recording at 6K, since it does crop into the sensor, whenever you're shooting cropped on the Panasonic S5, whether it's 4K 60 frames per second or 6K 30 frames per second, the focusing is a little bit better. For some reason, even though the Panasonic S5 has more focusing points, about 69 more focusing points, the A7S Mark II just does a better job at autofocusing. So let me go ahead and read some of my notes. So some of the advantages that the Panasonic S5 has over the A7S Mark II is 24 megapixels. It really doesn't matter to me all that much because I don't take too many pictures. Versus 12 megapixels on the A7S Mark II. But again, I really don't take any pictures. Even when I go on all my travels, I always say I'm going to take more pictures. That way I can upload them to social media and I can have more likes and this, that, the third. But when I get out there, I always forget to take pictures and I just end up taking videos. The ISO range on the A7S Mark II is insane, just like it was on the A7S Mark I, just like it is on the A7S Mark III. You're talking about 100 native ISO all the way to 102,000 ISO, and the image is still pretty usable up to 51,200 ISO, I think it is, and it's still pretty usable, where the Panasonic S5 goes from a native ISO of 80 all the way to 51,200. So the A7S Mark II tops out at double that, but the image quality is still usable all the way to the max to 100,000, and it's definitely usable at 51,200, where the Panasonic S5, anything over about 25,000 you really don't want to use because it creates too much noise. So this might be a plus for you if you mainly record things outside, and if you mainly record things inside, it might not be a plus for you. So the A7S Mark II has a low pass filter where the Panasonic S5 doesn't have one. Basically, if I had to describe what that would help with, is if you see patterns back here, I'm not sure if the camera is displaying it right now, but in certain patterns like a gate that has a lot more patterns going across all over it, you would see a little bit of like banding, a little bit of noise, a little bit of artifacts. It would just look weird. The Panasonic S5, you would see more of that. With the low pass filter, it kind of cuts some of that stuff off, but it takes away a little bit of the image quality. So that's why I'm very curious to find out if the image quality even looks any better on the A7S Mark II, just because it has that low pass filter, even though I have a constant f-stop of 2.8 on the Tamron 17 to 28 millimeter lens versus the kit lens, which is a 3.5 to 5.6 on the wider, on the 3.5 to 5.6 on the lens. That for me? Thank you. Because I'm a fruitcake.
That has paper on the bottom, don't make that.
No, it doesn't. Oh, yeah, I see it. Okay, so I wasn't recording at 6K before, but now I am definitely recording at 6K, 30 frames per second on the Panasonic S5. Now, when it comes to image stabilization, that was the #1 deal breaker for me upgrading from the A7S Mark II. I do love the A7S Mark II, but I do hate having to carry around a 3-axis gimbal just to have a stabilized image out of the A7S Mark II. I hate that with a passion. So with the Panasonic S5, I absolutely love how stable the image looks. It still gets a little bit of jitter, so it's not like a GoPro stabilization, but with the boost and the electronic and the image stabilization on the sensor turned on, it does an amazing job, to the point where I just went away for 2 weeks and I didn't even use my Osmo Pocket the whole entire time while I was walking and recording. The whole entire time I didn't use the Osmo Pocket. That's how good the image stabilization is on the Panasonic S5. Now on paper, it says that the A7S Mark II has 4.5 stops of stabilization and the Panasonic S5 only has 5 stops of stabilization. On paper, that's what it says. But in real life, a real life scenario, the Panasonic S5 just blows the boots off of the older A7S Mark II. Now, of course, having a flippy screen is way better than having a tilting screen. But the A7S Mark III also comes with a flippy screen, just like the Panasonic S5 does. In slow motion, the Panasonic S5 is way better. You get up to 180 frames per second with the full frame. I think you get up to 150 frames a second using autofocus continuous. With the A7S Mark II, you get up to 120 frames a second, but it crops into the sensor about 1.5 times. So you get a lot less focal distance, and you also get to crop into the sensor, so you get a little bit less image quality. The Panasonic S5 also has a touchscreen, which is way better than not having a touchscreen, but to me, it's like, it's something you could deal without, but it's definitely a convenience if you do have it. Now, let me mention the max resolution on the Panasonic S5 is 6K, which I'm recording in right now at 30 frames a second, H.265, 200 megabytes per second. We're on the A7S Mark II is Ultra HD 4K, not Cinema 4K, which the Panasonic S5 also records at 100 megabytes per second at H.264. Now, the Panasonic S5 shoots at 4K, H.265 at 150 megabytes per second, or it shoots 6K at 200 megabytes per second. And for you to get the equivalent of what the A7S Mark II shoots at, which is H.264, you will double it. Technically, not literally. Since it shoots H.265 at 150 megabytes per second, the equivalent of that at H.264 would be 300 megabytes per second. And 6K at 200 megabytes per second, the equivalent to that at H.264 would be 400 megabytes per second. So technically, but not literally, the Panasonic S5 shoots 6K resolution at the same bit rate as the A7S Mark III shoots 4K all ultra. Another deal breaker for me that really made me upgrade or want to upgrade was the inclusion of two SD card slots. Now, what is so important about 8-bit and 10-bit? To me personally, not a whole lot. I don't do much color grading. I usually just slap in a LUT and then just tweak the blending over a little bit, take a little bit off, add a little bit more. I really don't tweak the highlights and the shadows and all that stuff too much. But in some occasions, I do it. And for the most important occasions, for me, personally, it was important to have two SD card slots because out of all my years of recording, which is about 5 years, one SD card did fail on me. So out of 5 years of recording video, only one SD card failed on me. When I was recording a simple video of me riding my electric skateboard in the rain, I'll leave that in the description below. That skateboard also messed up on me after that day. I let it dry for like about 2-3 days, and then when I went to go ride it again, one of the motors had locked on me, but that's a whole nother story. And when I was recording that video, the SD card did actually fail on me, and it didn't record a long segment of that video that I recorded. And then I had to do it all over, but I was already too lazy because I already did it one time. So basically what I did was I just shortened that video up a little bit. For example, I've been to the Amazon jungle about 3 times in 3 different countries, and I ended up selling a lot of that footage in Adobe stock. And I would say that video footage made me about somewhere roughly about $1,500, which actually paid for, which you could actually say that it paid for one of my trips. Because that's how much money I roughly spend on them when I go out there. So you could say that it roughly paid for one of my trips, and had I not had the dual SD card and the SD card had failed on me, I would have been screwed out of those $1,500. So I sort of weighed my options a little bit. I really did want to buy the A7S Mark III, but I couldn't justify $3,500 because I know that I could sell my Tamron lens for about $600 to $700, and I know that I could sell my A7S Mark II within $700 to maybe all the way up to $1,000 going. So I knew that I could recuperate most of the money that I spent on the Panasonic S5. So the Panasonic S5 came out to about $2,500 with taxes, and I know that I'm gonna get like $1,500. So really, I only spent $1,000 on the camera. Where if I would have bought the A7S Mark III, of course I would have kept my Tamron 17 to 28 millimeter lens, just because it's so wide at 17 millimeters, and it's a constant f2.8 versus 3.5 to 5.6 and 20 millimeters. So not that good for vlogging, but still good enough. And then I would have had a hole in my pocket of $3,500, and then I probably would have recuperated like $1,000. So I would have had a hole in my pocket of about $2,500 versus having a hole in my pocket of $1,000. So it's a $1,500 to $2,000 price justifiable. To me, it wasn't, just because I'm going to get so much more out of the Panasonic S5. Now, I would have loved to have 4K without it being cropped, but unfortunately the Panasonic S5 does crop into the 4K as well as the 6K, but I just couldn't help it. A $2,000 camera that can record 6K resolution internally, no external recorder necessary. I just really couldn't help it. If it was a decision that you needed to make, if you had the A7S Mark II and you wanted to upgrade to something, I hope this video helped you make your decision. And also the internal 6K can only be recorded for about 15 minutes. They both have their 30-minute limit recording when they're all spec'd out to the highest resolution. The A7S Mark II has it on all of its recording formats. The Panasonic S5 can record infinite 4K at 8-bit internal. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, don't forget to hit the thumbs up. Don't forget to hit subscribe to watch more videos like this. And I'll see you guys on the next one. My name's Ruben Lopez, and I'm from New York, son. Peace! Really quick, we'll see how both of these cameras fare off in a little bit of low light. So right now I'm going to go ahead and turn off my ring light. This is the only light that I've been recording out of this whole entire time. So here we are in a little bit of low light, still controlled environment. I got 3 light bulbs above my head, roughly about 10 feet away from me. I'm going to go ahead and unplug 2 of those light bulbs now and leave the one that's actually pointing away from me, just to see what the low light looks like on both of these cameras. All right, I would say that this is pretty low. The light's pretty dim right now. There's only 1 light bulb that's pointing away from me, and my eyes are actually hurting a little bit. That's how low it is. So you guys can see how these cameras fare off. I'll tell you right now that the ISO on the Panasonic S5 is all the way up to 1600, and I am back to recording at 4K out of the Panasonic S5. The reason why this looks like a mess, this foam thing, I had it all boxed out nice and square, as you guys remember from my older videos. The reason why is because we have a new kitten in the house. Well, she's actually about 7 months old right now, but he's definitely has gone at it with this foam, and he's sharpening his nails and stuff like that, so he's ripping everything down. I really don't care too much about it anymore, but before I did, I'm probably going to end up changing my backdrop. So yeah, this is what the low light looks like on the Panasonic S5 versus the A7S Mark II. Now I'm going to go ahead and turn that light off, and I'm just going to have my computer screen on so you guys can see how that fares off. What's important to focus on is the noise level in the background in the shadows. On the Panasonic S5, we're shooting at 10 bits, so if I tweak the colors a little bit, it should fare off better than the A7S Mark II. But the A7S Mark II has been the low light king for the past 5 years, so let's go ahead and turn that light off and see how we're doing. Okay, now that the light is off and I only have the computer screen on, you guys will see how both of these cameras will fare off in low light. So let's see. I'm very curious to know if the A7S Mark II is doing better than the Panasonic S5 right now, because this is what the A7S Mark II was born to do, where the Panasonic S5 was not born to do this at all. But it should be doing pretty good just because it is a full frame sensor camera. Let's see how the autofocus works on both of these cameras. I'm so dark on the Panasonic S5, I wonder what I look like on the A7S Mark II right now. I'm gonna go ahead and turn the lights back on. Woo! So something that's also important is the battery life on the A7S Mark II. You have to use these tiny batteries. By the way, I used the new MOA batteries, which are rated at 1000 milliamp hours, just like the original A7S Mark II batteries rated at. And it actually performs at that rating. Like, it's actually just as good as the real ones. So if you know that if you buy most batteries from Amazon, most of them are rated for like 1000 milliamps, and really they just perform to half of that capacity. These batteries actually perform just as good as the original A7S Mark II battery. So if you do own an A7S Mark II and you're not going to upgrade, then you definitely should buy one of these batteries. I should also point out, I have it in my car right now, but I should also point out that the battery grip, the knockoff battery grip, which I think costs about 65 bucks versus 400 bucks for the original one, also performs just as good as the original one. You could change the shutter. You could do customizable buttons on it. It has another shutter for you to take pictures sideways. So it performs just as good as the original one, and you should definitely pick one of those up before you buy the original one. I'll also leave that one on the description below. Yeah, the batteries for the Panasonic S5 are double the capacity of the batteries for the A7S Mark II, so the batteries last twice as long. So now instead of carrying around 4 of these, I actually carry around 5 of these, but instead of carrying around 4 of these batteries, you can carry around 2 batteries for the Panasonic S5 and you're good to go. So I won't talk about the viewfinder, the resolution on the screens. The Panasonic has a better screen, but the A7S Mark II is such an old camera that, of course, the cheapest Panasonic camera is going to have a better screen. I won't go off on a rant on all the other specs because really they just don't do anything for me. I don't use them. I don't use any of these cameras to take pictures. But if you live in a big city like I do, where everything's pretty well lit even at night, then the Panasonic S5 is definitely good enough with the low light performance. So hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, don't forget to hit the thumbs up. Don't forget to hit subscribe to watch more videos like this, and I'll see you guys on the next one.